How much did the president know? And when did he know it? During Watergate, one person described it as a cancer on the presidency. And who might imagine at that time that a president might actually bug himself? But in the seminal inquiry that is remembered from that time was the crescendo finale after one senator broke partisan ranks to ask the critical question, how much did the president know? And when did he know it? A question that many even today are asking publicly upon the recent news that the President of the United States has been infected with a pandemic pathogen that proved to some to be even bigger than God in churches that were closed indefinitely. According to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the president invited infection by refusing to wear a mask. And comedian Stephen Colbert has joined in the rebuke, scolding the president for sowing the wrath from his ridiculing people who wore masks for protection. And perhaps you too agree, despite the fact that the nation's only doctor serving as governor, Ralph Northam, who had even proposed that a bandana would protect you, was overcome by this invisible enemy. With his wife, causing State Senator Jennifer L. McClellan, an African-American from Richmond, where blacks account for over 60% of the fatalities, to fall into despair, remarking that it's a reminder of how serious this disease is. It's not going away, and even with the best precautions, we don't know a lot about it. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here, may be a great line for a poet like Dante Alighieri talking about hell, but a terrible way to launch her campaign for governor. So for the next few moments, let's discuss what the president knew about a novel coronavirus, which is also on the topic of several litigations currently on appeal in both state and federal courts in Richmond. Coincidentally, litigations from which the nation's only doctor serving as a state governor has chosen the peculiar legal strategy of running from the Alexandria City Sheriff and the United States Marshal to avoid the jurisdiction of the courts, conduct that is chargeable as a felony for obstruction of justice, while he continues to urge Virginians that even a bandana will protect you, and lamenting how much the president's rejection of science has professionally pained him as a licensed practitioner of medicine, albeit now also infected with a novel coronavirus. Did the president's failure to wear a mask make him more vulnerable to be infected by this pandemic pathogen than the governor of Virginia? Might be a good question from which to start. So if we take a look at the science that has been published by the Centers for Disease Control, what might we find? Under the title Evidence for Effectiveness of Masks, produced under pressure from litigation we initiated in Virginia on behalf of the president on August 7th, the CDC clarified guidance that has been known for years, stating masks are recommended as a simple barrier to help prevent respiratory droplets from traveling into the air onto other people. When the person wearing the mask coughs, sneezes, talks, or raises their voice, this is called source control. So, at least according to the CDC and years of science, if the president wore a mask and if he was infected, he would have a simple barrier to help prevent him from infecting somebody else. But it has also been known since at least 2010, when the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health began planning for the contingency of a possible pandemic that might appear in the future, just like the present, that the results obtained in the study show that common fabrics materials may provide only marginal protection against nanoparticles, including those in the size ranges of virus-containing particles in exhaled breath. Translation, any substitute for medical-grade protection would provide at most marginal protection that might prevent penetration of a microbial particle measuring less than 5 microns. And all scientists who have recently been tear gassed may have found empirical proof that the smallest presentation of active ingredient for tear gas measures 0.6 microns, or 6 times larger than the largest configuration of SARS-CoV-2 particles. So, did the president's failure to wear a mask increase his risks of being infected? The science clearly says no. So why are you mandated to wear a mask, according to Dr. Northam? Because he believes that you are not aware or responsible when you get sick and have no idea when you or your child presents asymptomatic signs of infection, like coughing or sneezing. And therefore, because you are ignorant, selfish, and reckless, just like the president, apparently you need to be told to wear a mask. And if you already early voted for that, you were stuck with that which you chose, because for purposes of voting, you were treated actually like an adult. And you should have done your homework. It is what it is. So how exactly did the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, manage to get infected if it was not because he denied the science of wearing a facial covering that real science established long ago is useless, especially if, like tear gas, the pathogen is being transmitted primarily as an aerosol, a point recently conceded by Governor Northam and endorsed by 239 scientists who presented that new model to the World Health Organization in July, including rock star environmental engineer Lindsay C. Marr from Virginia Tech. Well, since school is closed, let's resort to a short class on advanced biology in a virtual classroom. Scientists have determined that when you exhale droplets, either by speaking or through asymptomatic signs of infection like coughing or sneezing, recall, the largest droplets measuring up to 100 microns reach the floor within less than 1 second without significant evaporation. Splish splash. They just drop because of gravity, subject to the laws of gravity. But the range of risk for spread of infections is generally within the range of what are called medium to large sized droplets that measure between 5 and 10 microns. How large is a micron? Look at a period at the end of a sentence in a book. The National Institutes for Science say that measures exactly 350 microns, or 35 times larger than your largest size droplet that poses a potential threat of infection for you. But epidemiologists discuss the potential for infection. They are actually not even concerned about that sole particle that you may have read about in National Geographic back in April that traveled as far as 26 feet. Because for a person to be infected in a respiratory tract infection, he must have a sufficient quantum of those microbial particles from that infection enter the entrances of his respiratory tract, which you may recall from biology means your nose, which should be covered, and your mouth, which should be covered if you're trying to protect yourself with a mask that does not protect you. And it is that infectious dose of contaminants that must be prevented from entering your body that an epidemiologist must consider to develop a barrier to actually protect you. Kind of like a goalie in soccer has to be in the way of the ball to stop it from coming, and he has to know that he's playing soccer and needs to look for the ball. So for review, we have droplets that are expelled through talking, coughing, or sneezing, and an infectious dose. Two things critical to remember. How much of a novel coronavirus has to get to your nose or mouth? Well, the exact amount, perhaps, because scientists were more concerned about conducting studies to prove that your facial coverings are protection in a pandemic, they actually do not know. But if you have a mind and can read, you actually don't need the scientists to get a pretty good idea of what we're really dealing with in a pandemic crisis. Tuberculosis, unlike COVID-19, is caused by bacteria, which is substantially larger than a virus, and which is a living organism that, unlike a virus, can replicate itself without a human host. And a long time ago, in a laboratory, testing what is called the third Koch's postulate, or isolating a pathogen and introducing it to a healthy cell in an experiment to see what occurs, they determined that it takes exactly 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 individual bacilli particles to infect a human lung cell. So, Koch's postulates are one way to determine the infectious dose to protect you from a novel coronavirus that has killed over 200,000 Americans, over half of whom are the elderly in nursing homes, a vulnerable population that was known to be vulnerable from the very, very beginning, but which not even the nation's only doctor serving as a state governor did anything to protect, even after we initiated litigation to compel him to do so. And while Northam has spent time expressing his grief about the president's failures to follow the science, the fact is that for whatever reason, he never performed this relatively simple scientific experiment of taking a novel coronavirus and seeing exactly how many of those particles are required to deliver an infectious dose to you. An infectious dose that once it takes hold on you, still takes between 8 and 12 hours to permit you to actually be infected and have a capacity to infect someone else, making the possibility of a super spread event pretty much impossible using a chain reaction kind of model. But since viruses are very, very small, just a simple strand of RNA wrapped in a sheath, despite being the most abundant biological particle in the world, even scientists don't know about them. And despite their discovery back at the end of the 19th century, most of what is known is still debated between scientists and has developed only over the past 2 decades. But those professionals engaged in infectious disease control long ago developed another means to determine a little more knowledge about how a microbial particle infects you. And that may be a term you actually heard about lately in the news: tracer contacts. And if you are hearing about tracer contacts for the very first time in November, that is actually not a good thing, because it is actually the very first thing that infectious disease control professionals do, because it efficiently makes use of limited medical resources by performing 2 jobs at the same time. First, rather than attempt to build a large haystack to locate a tiny needle of a virus running around in the population, it assumes that if you are infected with a deadly pathogen in a pandemic, you are probably going to report to a medical facility to get tested, where they can perform a test to confirm that you actually have the disease. That is where testing fits inside infectious disease control. Not random universal tests to find out maybe you're infected, maybe you're not. But then they can begin to ask you about the other persons that you may have infected, because logically, if you are infected with an infectious disease, more likely than not, you probably infected the people with whom you recently had some contact. That's why they call it trace contacts. But the nation's only doctor serving as a state governor waited until April, a month after locking down the state, to even begin recruiting people, up to 1,300, to perform this priority task. And by June, despite receiving over 6,000 resumes, he managed to hire only 168. That was a doctor, now infected, who told you to wear a mask. When Governor Northam totally locked down the state, he stated that he had relied on his authority under VA Code Section 44-146.16, which requires him to determine that a communicable disease transmittable between persons exists that is being transmitted from person to person. And on March 15th, he even issued a statement that had not been done when he outlawed all non-essential gatherings of 100 persons or more, effectively closing down half the churches in the state. He just panicked, apparently, hearing about a pandemic and closed down everything, ignoring the law, unaware that the term pandemic only means that a pathogen has crossed national borders and has evidence of infections around the world and does not imply a universal condition or necessity for everyone to be scared everywhere. And that was a doctor, a scientist. But up to that point in time, at least one nation in the world had actually taken the time to engage in a robust tracer contact follow-up operation. The very same nation that the nation's only doctor serving as a state governor, Ralph Northam, took for his example in closing down the state, apparently unaware that the Chinese only closed down Wuhan, where they had found an actual outbreak, not just freaking out about some general pandemic about which you may even have read or seen in the news. And what they found after observing over 56,000 laboratory-confirmed infections from a novel coronavirus and deploying teams of 5 epidemiologists per day to perform tracer contact follow-up every day may actually surprise you, especially if you actually believe that the president got infected because he failed to wear a mask, like Dr. Fauci says. They found that less than 5% of the tracer contacts were infected with the disease and actually refused to describe a novel coronavirus and COVID-19 as an infectious or communicable disease because of that failure to find a high incidence of person-to-person transmission of infection. In fact, the Assistant Deputy General for the World Health Organization, the person who actually led the delegation into China and an epidemiologist himself, stated in an interview at the beginning of March that he was surprised by 2 things. First, that the infectiousness for the pathogen that caused the outbreak was so low. In fact, lower than the flu, where he said, an epidemiologist, a veteran epidemiologist, said that you would find 20 to 40% of tracer contacts being infected, which is substantially larger than less than 5% that they found for COVID-19. But also he expressed great surprise because even that low number of secondary infections were being found the further you got from Wuhan. And usually in science on Earth is the same no matter where you go on Earth and does not change when you leave a particular city or even state or even nation. But this novel coronavirus, very novel indeed, did just exactly that. So, if you have an emerging disease that is infecting people in large numbers and appears to be spreading, but which has demonstrated very little ability to do that on its own, what is the logical conclusion? If you ask a scientist lately, the answer is they don't know. And in part, that is because, like in geometry, a scientist is supposed to be bound by the scientific method that requires you to state only that which you can actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt, just like the burden of proof that is required in court to convict a person of a particular crime. A scientist is not supposed to speculate or write a check on research that can't cover it. And now here we are in a pandemic crisis. Gubernatorial candidates are expressing hopelessness and despair. The nation's only doctor serving as a governor is infected, just like the president he condemned for not following what he had called the science. The masks Joe Biden wants to use to eliminate the crisis will not work, and failure is not an option if you want to live. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, if you remember one movie where failure was not an option, a character played by Gary Sinise also contracted an infectious disease. Measles, as you may recall, or at least he tested positive for measles on a test. The scientists at NASA were very concerned about that positive test because they knew that a person with measles, a respiratory tract infection, believe it or not, it also caused by a virus, would result in 90% of the people with whom he came in contact, close contact, also to get infected. In fact, like chickenpox, measles is one of the most infectious viruses known to man, more than 180 times more infectious than what has been demonstrated by a novel coronavirus that has spread all over the world, leaving a trail of havoc and destruction in its path. And the question for science remains today how that could have been done. Just what makes that little old ant actually move a rubber tree plant? Well, probably more than high hopes. If you take the time to think about the low infectiousness and pair that with the requirement for an infectious dose, you have to logically conclude that at some point, any person who was infected was in some environment where there was suddenly a high concentration of a virus with little chance on its own to infect anyone, but suddenly found in a sufficient quantity to deliver an infectious dose. And the only way that that can be done is for it to be delivered by some means that is, more likely than not, outside of nature and epidemiological projections. And you must therefore conclude that the president did not contract a novel coronavirus because he came in contact with some other person who was infected, or because he failed to protect himself with a useless mask, but rather that an enemy of the president and the entire United States made a delivery of a sufficient quantum of infectious particles to his breathable air to infect him and his wife. And that is the very definition of transnational terrorism. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress. With liberty, honor, and excellence, by God, we shall make America great again. Honest.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.